Um, okay, so it looks like we're filling out. Just for those joining, just a warning if we're recording this. Um, Again, not sure what we're going to do with it, but just want to let you know. Daniel, I don't know if you can see people on screen, but the main team leading the hi.
Hi.
Hey.
Sorry, I didn't realize I was off.
The main team leading the health project is Cam and Henri there. But everybody at some point has touched it, especially when we started. So Coco,
Yep.
who did her thesis and continued research on sanatoriums, was kind of a
Oh,
really
cool.
coincidental addition right when we started the project. Jesse, who's one of the most senior designers in the office system, was on it early on and kind of acts with me as a sort of editor with Cam and Henri doing the heavy lifting. But everybody's come across it, and Bella might have explained. It was really it's just an initiative. I think it's something that we wanted to do out of self-interest, and
Right.
obviously out of sort of self-obsession currently.
Honestly, I think that's kind of, I mean, off the bat, just one of the most interesting things about it, like an initiative-based hospital, because normally they're so just tied up in legislation and red tape and all sorts of boring legalese. So I think, I don't know, I think that in itself is actually really fascinating.
I mean, we haven't even given thought yet what happens if this becomes more real, which is further down the road.
Right.
We have a couple initiatives, and I can imagine the kind of red tape around them is probably nothing like it is around a healthcare providing kind of service.
Right.
But certainly as a piece of research and as a study, and I think just something as a foil for conversation, it's quite exciting for us.
Right. And I mean, I don't see how it could possibly hurt any other possible project that
Sure.
eventually develops.
So I'd love if you wanted to give a quick intro. We tried to brief the office on who you were and what you did, but obviously hearing from you would be awesome.
Sure. I often have trouble describing what I do because I have a wide range of interests. When I was studying, what I basically did was I followed a general theme of hygiene, but there's no way to actually study hygiene directly. So I started in architecture and became interested in sort of hygienic infrastructure, infrastructure in general, but things like public toilets, sewers, gas pipes, even like the post office, things like that. And then I eventually went on to do architectural theory, and then I went on to do the history of science, and then I actually did a fine arts degree because I was concerned with aesthetics more than anything. And that's where I kind of came to. So the shorthand I use for what I do is, I call it political aesthetics.
Okay.
And other theorists will use the same term in sort of slightly different ways. But I think political aesthetics is a good way of describing the kind of overlap between the politics of health and the body, and also the representations of health and the body, and the sort of translation of those representations into politics, into the political, that is, into like, like actual law. I wrote briefly down like some areas of interest that I had that I thought were pertinent, and I just like, the list ended up being so ridiculously long that I was like, yeah, political aesthetics is the way to go.
From a political aesthetic standpoint, is your focus still on health and hygiene, or kind of broader politically?
So yes, I mean, I have a pretty extended definition understanding of hygiene. And so I did a project recently where I was working with flags, because for me, there's always an aesthetic component to hygiene. Um, Freud Freud describes the sort of basic principles of civilization as requiring three things, which is cleanliness, beauty, and order, which are kind of intertwined, and each of which are obviously extremely loaded. So cleanliness is one thing, order is another, that can mean all sorts of things relating to sort of like state-sponsored violence, or like more social theory type stuff. But interestingly, he includes beauty within that sort of formula. And I think that's super important. Not so much that it's beauty in like this sort of traditional sense you might think of it, but rather that there is an aesthetic component. Like it could just as easily be ugly or smell repulsive or smell like nothing. I just, yeah, I think that's the difference between like something like sanitation, which is like a really like sort of pragmatic, practical process, and hygiene, which is more of like a kind of pseudo social science that never really took off. I mean, it did take off. It took off in a big way, but then it kind of died in the 19th century because it was just too 19th century. And what we got out of it was sociology, and we got cybernetic theory, systems theory, and like a whole host of things. Engineering, for instance, a lot of what architects do as well.
Mhm. With the kind of current pandemic,
Yes.
uh, how would you define the aesthetic about the current, like the kind of
Ooh, good question.
current pandemic? Is there I mean, because I mean, we're seeing obviously like everybody's inundated with information and news and data and
Right.
the kind of aesthetic.
I mean, there's definitely an aesthetic component for sure. I'm going to say the most annoying answer first, which is that there's an aesthetics of the invisible. So there's a kind of like social effect that's happening, which is that we don't know where the threat is coming from. I mean, in terms of the history of epidemics, there are things like cholera, which was waterborne. It took them a while to figure that out, but once they did, it was actually quite easy to contain. Well, it wasn't easy, but it was possible to contain the sort of vector for that disease. With an epidemic like AIDS that was sexually transmitted. So it wasn't just kind of like this vacuous, nebulous, I don't know, aura that sort of may or may not be lingering on surfaces or emanating from someone walking down the street. So I feel like the aesthetics of the invisible of this disease are really interesting, especially because that it has this kind of really long incubation period, and that some people are asymptomatic, both of which are just like, you know, very bizarre and actually very scary traits of this disease. But I think it becomes, as a result, this like really clear reflection of like social anxiety, basically, because all of a sudden it's like the air you share with other people, which I don't even know how to measure, becomes a threat.
I mean,
You know?
I assume that has something to do with also trying to assign blame for where it comes from.
Yes, I was also going to say that there's fucking racism. um, like in a large part pushed by Trump and his cronies. which is absolutely ridiculous because one of the traits of a pandemic, especially as opposed to an epidemic, is that like the boundaries of nationhood or ethnicity don't fucking matter at all because like the virus does not care.
And I think that sort of one of the most striking things, at least that's impacted me personally, I think with this whole period, is how everything has been affected.
Right.
The air has been affected, and to that point about it visible and kind of just like in the ether everywhere in some way, it's had an impact. So it's like the kind of clear definition of it is sort of impossible because it's infinitely across the spectrum. But I guess in that way, it was kind of leading into it being a part of the air in your cities, it being a part of kind of the world you inhabit, no matter where this pandemic originated, where it's spreading. And so I think we were really curious about, and I'm very curious actually what you think, how this issue of, I think, health, especially with this particular virus, is so prevalent that I think obviously that question is like, what happens after this? What are we going to look like after this? What aesthetics are going to come out of this, but also just like, are we going to change? Are the city's going to change? Are politics going to change? So obviously our question being architects was like, how does architecture change? But I mean, even less specific than that, I think was just like, is there a difference after this than before? Or for someone like you that's been studying these things for a while, is this kind of just like a continuation of things that you've been seeing rather than break or change?
Yes and no. It's similar in so many ways, in so many disappointing ways. Like people are reacting in some ways exactly the way they did in 1832 in regards to cholera, or in 1152 in regards to the plague. You know, scapegoating, this idea of racism, this idea of a source, this idea of someone being responsible for like engineering the disease, or more kind of conspiracy theory-esque type aspects of it. That seems to be a timeless human reaction, because this is not an informed opinion, but I think because people are stupid, and people have always been stupid.
That's a fact. I think that's a fact.
Yeah. But this virus does also have very specific traits to it. It has very specific symptoms, namely no symptoms sometimes. That I think is the most terrifying thing about this disease, or about the pathogen, really. And it's airborne, more or less, or droplet borne, or it kind of seems now like it's probably both. And it's a clever disease in that it is both airborne and it affects your lungs. And while it affects your lungs, it also affects your blood. It affects your ability for your blood to carry oxygen, all while attacking the lining of your lungs. We apparently have something called a soapy oil, I think it is, that basically keeps our lungs moist. And it attacks the process that allows us to produce that. So basically your lungs like crack, and they dry up and crack like an old dry sponge or something, which is horrifying. But yeah, Sloterdijk wrote a book recently called, within the past 10 years, called Terror from the Air, which was both about 9/11 and the threat that came from the air, but it was also linking that to the history of chemical warfare and of gas warfare in World War II up until like basically Saddam Hussein's use of chemical weapons against his own people. I think this was before Assad started also doing that same thing. But I think that is almost the best analogy for an airborne virus like this. Not that this is the first airborne virus ever, but you know, my expertise is actually not on COVID. Obviously, I'm not a doctor, and I'm not, you know, actively researching it. My expertise is on cholera mostly, and that's a very different type of disease, mainly because it's bacterial, but also because it's like confined to water, and it comes out the other end of your body. It's transmitted through feces. And then there's sexually transmitted diseases, obviously, like AIDS. There's sort of parasite-borne, like malaria, and there are, I was just thinking of another type of vector disease. It'll come to me in a second. But what's interesting to me is that the airborne virus, and especially one that's as kind of effective at spreading as this one, really basically touches. I mean, it doesn't touch it. It infects, I guess, the what we call the public sphere. You know, like to me, like a city is made of squares. Like, this is my kind of like my probably French upbringing, but like the city to me is like, you know, public spaces that are as much about like the ground surface that you inhabit as like the sort of air around it. And then there's this kind of imagination of the greenery is somehow filtering that air, and that there are lungs of the city, and et cetera, et cetera.
I mean, I think that notion of shared air is something really incredible about cities, and has never felt dangerous until now.
Right.
Or like, with the exception of heating and cooling, I don't think it was anything that felt like it was affecting how cities or buildings were designed, probably also until, at least for me, until now.
Right.
How have you had a chance to think about it, or what do you think, what changes do you think will happen? I'll just be specifically about architecture, given now dealing with this invisible, airborne, kind of ubiquitous, potentially ubiquitous.
But I think, Dong, I don't think you can say that this is ubiquitous, right? Because like, I think if you look at both, I mean, it's really interesting, Daniel, what you were just saying, like the maps of where COVID is most highly concentrated is in the outer boroughs, where there are people of color who are mostly essential workers who have to still use the subways to get in because they can't just work from home. And the amount of people, like if you look at the statistics, the demographics of who's dying from this, it is way more Black and brown people than it is white and Asian people. So I don't think you can like say that this is ubiquitous. Like, it's having an incredibly like detrimental and deleterious effect on very, very certain communities that have a lot to do with environmental racism and just like medical racism, like all these things that are like super built in, and it's like, it's not ubiquitous.
But I think perhaps what he meant, or what I interpreted it as, was that the fear or the anxiety is that there's this ubiquitous threat. But of course, I mean, privileged people who tend to be white in this country are the ones who can remove themselves from that space of threat. Whereas the people who have no choice but to go out in public still are the ones who end up suffering from the threat. but do you know what I mean? That like to me, it seems like there's like it seems like there's like two steps there. Like there's like first of all the thread itself, which could be anywhere, and I think in anyone's imagination that's ubiquitous. But the sort of exposure and the suffering is not ubiquitous. It's like very unevenly distributed.
Yeah, so I guess like with that being said, and I totally agree with that, like is the question like how do we prevent this from happening in this
You
way?
mean, sorry, how do you prevent what from happening? Like just the racial divide?
Yeah. Like how do you bring that into like how we shape the city?
I mean, that's a tough question. Because it's so entrenched and just systemic. Not that that's an excuse to not do anything about it.
Was it an issue? I mean, I assume it was an issue during cholera.
It was in terms of the urban poor, and there were all these like maps produced of East London, showing the sort of crowdedness, and then eventually the first social housing projects developed. Arnold Circus in Shoreditch, which is now very chic, was a sort of Peabody estate that was designed to be washable and aerated, could be aerated. But there wasn't. I mean, there wasn't as much of a sort of clear racial divide there, obviously, but there was a very clear class divide. And I mean, even much earlier than that, most older cities actually have their like sort of wealthier areas on hilltops or whatnot because of the miasma theory of disease, which held that like that like sort of smell particles were what carried and transmitted diseases. So they would go to places that had better wind circulation. So like Highgate and Hampstead in London is to this day like still like a very well-to-do area full of these like big mansions because that's where the rich went when the city was undergoing, God, I don't remember which epidemic that was. That must have been a tuberculosis epidemic.
I mean, I guess the same thing with that. I don't know if it's still outdated, but the general city planning principle of having open spaces and more ventilation through a city, especially for, I guess, airborne diseases, to hypothetically move more natural air through a city. I think in principle isn't biased, but how it's distributed and used and what parts of cities are built around those open spaces and who gets to live around those open spaces obviously has plenty of bias in it.
Right.
So I'm curious if like this, like I guess from a principles point of view, from an architectural principles point of view, do you see this having any impact on how parts of the cities might be understood as built or built?
I mean, in a lot of ways, the idea of aerating the city is not a new idea at all. You know, the solution that we've been provided with so far has been social distancing of 6 feet away from each other, which is a surprisingly like old-fashioned way of dealing with a problem. So like, you know, there are already towers in the park kind of, you know, typologies that were invented basically to make life more streamlined and hygienic and convenient in other ways. But also one thing I've been thinking about a lot is the sort of appeal of suburbs. You know, I was educated and I grew up at a time when suburbs were completely demonized, and they were like, oh, suburbs are killing the city, and, you know, like car traffic is heating up the globe, and, you know, whatever, they're so inefficient. But like, if you think about post 1918 Spanish flu, like, I can see why you would want your own little space that's separated from other people, that's close to the city, that's close to an economic center, but that isn't like an apartment building or a tenement.
Can I share actually the pack we sent you real quick?
Sure.
It's not
I'm
so
just going to interrupt 1 second because I know that Cass and Dong need to jump on another call for 15 minutes. Is that right? Or
Last name already jumped on the call. I'll try to do this another, for myself anyway, another 15 minutes because I don't want to stay on this. But yeah, I think I may need to jump off very quickly and then hopefully make it back before it ends. Oh, what am I looking at? So, and I'm curious to know what you think, because I can imagine someone whose focus is looking at health and hygiene, the aesthetics of it, I think the kind of built, let's say, properties of it in some ways, it may have a very different reading. But one of the original, let's say, naive observations we had, or things that we found most interesting, or that I found most interesting, was just this relationship between health and the public space, or health in the city in general.
Mm-hmm.
And that, at least from an institutional point of view, let's say hospitals or clinics, they don't, at least to me, feel like they're, even though they're very much a civic service, they don't feel like they're part of the city in the same way that a public park feels like it's part of the city. In terms of my description of it, well, you sort of step outside of the city realm to go into a hospital or a clinic, engage in whatever treatment or procedure or discussion you need to engage in, then you kind of return back to the city.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so one of the thoughts we had was, given how clear health, the kind of health that we're dealing with right now, but health has an effect on how we engage with each other and engage with the city. Is there potentially a way to make that idea of health, in a very measurable way, but the idea of health much more day-to-day from a civic perspective? Not something for reactionary work, something that's more for preventative. Arguably, as dumb as it is, like things like what you eat, which obviously you do day-to-day, going to gym and doing exercise in the city is sort of aligned with that, part of that.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
What's on screen now anyway was, we chose a site in the middle of Chinatown. These were the different kind of medical facilities and institutions around. And this is just the site we were choosing, which is currently, I think, a DP building. I forget actually which agency.
That's not Two Bridges, right? That's north of Two Bridges.
I think we're in Two Bridges.
Okay, all right.
Oh, maybe technically it stops here.
Oh, okay, I see, yeah, all right.
We're basically at Two Bridges. Anyway, it was just kind of this very dumb diagram of, is there a way to approach, let's get a healthcare facility. I don't want to call it a hospital because I know that we're not yet achieving, and we probably won't achieve the kind of technical capacity that a hospital needs to achieve. But is there a way to approach a healthcare facility in a way that is much more integrated with the public space or city life, whatever that means? And I'm curious, for you, is that even an interesting way to approach a project like this?
I think absolutely. Sorry, did I interrupt you?
No, please.
I think absolutely, actually, because I think there's a general trend in health towards holistic treatments, in the sense that, like, you know, you can treat someone in a hospital, but if they're eating in a way that makes them obese, it is going to impact their health negatively, you know? So, like, you always get told by doctors, like, oh, you should quit smoking, or you should eat better, or you should exercise more. But if if that was like actually integrated into a sort of, I was going to say hospital, into an institution of some sort, it would make sense. There's also something called the Maggie Centers. Have you looked into these at all?
Yeah.
And those are interesting because they're essentially clinics, and they do perform treatments there, but they're also community spaces for family members and for people who are recovering from cancer, and it's cancer specific, and cancer's interesting because it's not contagious. So that was one question I had actually, is how would you foresee the issue of contagion?
Excuse me. Well, I think we had approached the project. Let me actually share again.
Sorry, did I not answer the question? Was there a question?
It was sort of just getting your take on the relationship between health and the city. So it wasn't so much a question, it's just going to prompt for a discussion, but I think you.
Okay. Well, I mean, so I just want to make it clear that there are many relationships between health and the city, and that there are many types of health. And one very significant relationship has been in terms of the relationship between contagion and urbanism. And a lot of the infrastructure and a lot of the kind of like literal spatial organizations we see in the city have been responses to various contagions.
In terms of contagion, obviously one way we're dealing with it now is isolation.
Right.
Are there other ways to deal with it physically, contagion, or is it really just keeping contagious people and the contagious virus or bacteria in one place and not letting it spread? Is it basically isolation?
Well, it depends on the type of contagion. If it's a bacterial pathogen, usually you can treat it with antibiotics now. Obviously, that wasn't the case in the 14th century. If it's waterborne, you create what's called a closed world. So you create pipes that sort of filter through the city so that the wastewater and the fresh water are separated. If it's sexually transmitted, you educate about condoms. Also, now they've developed some retroviral medications which are proving to be very effective with HIV, but now that there's a new viral threat, they're having to figure out which antiretrovirals are most effective. And Trump has decided for some fucking reason that this, what's it called, chloroquine, is the magic bullet, but with zero evidence whatsoever. And an antiretroviral is never a magic bullet. It's always a cocktail, and it takes a long time to lower the viral load.
Do you see that, because especially now the isolation issue, we see it across really architectural means, like number of beds, how hospitals themselves are inundated, setting up Javits Center, creating places for beds in isolation in places that weren't meant for that. Obviously being in our homes for a month straight kind of thing. So I was curious if, well, when we first started the project, I'll pull up this diagram real quick. We were trying to put together a program for the project. I won't go into specifics, but the idea, which you can kind of see underneath this like city tag, this said individual, and this was all collective. And so we had kind of split, and this is very much a direct response to what current COVID response was showing, was split between individual space and collective space. And we have since kind of modified that to not really be about this kind of isolation thing anymore. Now, instead of individual and health, or sorry, individual and collective, it's more like city and health as a split. But there was a while where this exact diagram was, instead of health, that was isolation or individual. Instead of city, that was collective. And it was a way to sort of segment and thread, let's say, like places of individual or isolation through the city. But I'm curious if, and especially through history that you've seen, like, do you see us constantly having to have places of isolation moving forward, or will something like coronavirus no longer need isolation in the future, but something new might create a need again for places of isolation as a way to treat?
I mean, it's funny because most epidemiologists were saying that it's basically an inevitability that there will be a pandemic and that it will probably be respiratory, but everyone assumed it would be an influenza. And then out of nowhere, this fucking coronavirus shows up. So that was quite surprising to a lot of people. There's an interesting documentary on Netflix, and it's interesting because it's basically all about how you should be scared about influenza, and it like basically predicts exactly what happens, but with the wrong disease. But that's kind of an aside. Your question is a very good question. It's the question of the hospital, basically. And it's a very historical question, and it's basically the entire subject of Foucault's obsession with medical space. The invention of hospitals kind of came about in the 18th century, but were really developed more exclusively into what Foucault calls the clinic and the clinical gaze in the 19th century. And what that basically means is that hospitals became centralized sites in the city rather than being spread out through like church networks or whatever. This developed in Paris after the revolution because they were centralizing the government and because they were trying to sort of create a strong networked city that was based on understandings of circulation and flow. But the result of this is that they built a bunch of hospitals, more hospitals than had ever been in a single city at one time. And that these hospitals were highly organized spaces. So they had specific wards for specific problems. And doctors started professionalizing. So they started looking into, because, you know, before the mid 18th century, you had surgeons, you had physicians, and then you had barbers. So barbers were basically people like in the Middle Ages who had like knives essentially, and they would do anything with a knife that would, you know, range from shaving your face to bloodletting to amputating something, which is what it is. But anyways, so that sort of invention of the physician became like a professional body, and they started looking at illness in a different way. Foucault describes it as a shift from how do you feel? This is the question the doctor was asking. The shift from how do you feel to where does it hurt? Because they were able to like localize the pain or the ailment within the body, and then sort of tally those symptoms on a mass scale because of the hospital system that was centralized and that was recording information with statistical data. So basically what it was is that the individual would come into the hospital and get an individual treatment on an individual part of their body. And then all that individual information was taken and compiled into a public resource. So all of a sudden, instead of like one doctor you know, having like anecdotal evidence of the people he's seen with diphtheria, it there was a system invented where you could access like all the information about diphtheria, like all the symptoms, what was effective, when it was breaking out, what populations were affected, et cetera, et cetera. And then that way you could create a classification system of different diseases, and like the similarities and differences between them. And from there also that created different treatments and different instruments for analyzing certain ailments. Like very famously, the stethoscope was invented first as like a kind of tube. So they would literally, it has a funny name, percussion. They would use percussion. So they would literally drum on the patient to hear what was going on inside. And then eventually that led to the invention of the stethoscope, which is, I mean, it's for the respiratory system, right? You can hear the heart and the lungs and how they interact together, and if there's any sort of blockage or whatever. But all that stems from this kind of specification of the hospital as a space and an institution that was both for individual treatments as well as for a public database of knowledge.
I have so many questions, but I have to jump off for like 10 minutes. So
Sure, no problem.
But I'll be back soon, hopefully. Bella, I'm just going to leave this one on and try to just call Cass so I don't really interrupt the video.
All right, and Cam and Henry, maybe you two can speak a little bit to the more to the like the actual project and maybe any questions you guys have, or just generally to get sort of dive in more of the specifics of the concept of what you guys were getting into.
Yeah.
So can I be annoying and interrupt? Because I think I've given a lot of sort of background information and whatever theory. But what I'm getting from you guys in terms of your questions is that it seems like you're very concerned with creating a hospital that isn't, I mean, hospital loosely defined, that isn't or that's, I guess, as isolated as it needs to be for treatment purposes, but is also equally unisolated, right? Yeah. That there's an effort to bring, I guess, to isolate the isolation. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that one of the things we've been kind of mulling around with is, since pandemics and epidemics are not a kind of one-size-fits-all solution, and as you've mentioned frequently, a lot of them don't require isolation. Like, how do we calibrate kind of our ambitions? So on one hand, on the kind of health side of things, that's one thing we're juggling. And then on the other side, we're really thinking about how does this be a kind of amenity for the community and for the public, which it kind of inherently is at odds with the idea of isolation. So yeah, that's kind of where our head's at. And your remarks are really like incredibly helpful, kind of helping us to navigate what are the requirements that we might need. And since there is no one size fits all, what should we be kind of equipped to tackle?
I think,
right.
just to jump in as well, Cam, is kind of what Cam's saying, but is just that I think like our kind of like very quick studies of existing hospitals is that they feel very removed from society, or removed, you know, like, I mean, whether they're in a city or not, they're removed from that city. They're generally kind of like closed off spaces that unless you're using the hospital, you're not really engaging with it. And certainly when you're in the hospital, you're not really engaging with the greater city around you or the community around you. So I think something that we found a lot of interest in was like in a time when, I mean, I think that this sort of coronavirus was sort of catalytic to start looking into this, but how can health become a sort of less, not that I would say it's taboo, but a less sort of like hidden part of our everyday lives and more just an integrated part of life, that everyone gets sick. There's preventative health. There's like, you know, I don't know what the other term is for a traditional sort of like hospital or doctor. But that these things might become less of a sort of like a removed part of our cities and our culture.
Right. It's interesting. I mean, this is a debate that exists within the sort of social studies of medicine and the history of medicine. There's something called the McCone theory. I forget how to spell McCone, but basically he put forward an idea that hand washing basically and like basic sanitation principles that were incorporated into our daily lives actually had a more profound effect on the human quality of life and on the decrease of disease and of mortality than the traditional thought system, which was that it was these kind of heroic doctor figures and magic bullet treatments like surgeries and antibiotics. So it's quite interesting to think about how medical knowledge has already been integrated into society in a way that we like now almost completely take for granted. Like we flush toilets and like we don't like thank the heavens that we've been like saved from cholera or whatever. And we like brush our teeth because we know that our teeth will, you know, rot if we don't. But at the same time, the hospital itself that the hospital, the sort of normative modern hospital that we think of, which really hasn't been changed all that much since the invention of the clinic in the 19th century, is very isolated, but in many ways for good reason, because they require some distance from, people who are immunocompromised need distance from other sick people, or even from healthy people who have something that might, injure them, harm them, I mean. But yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting dilemma because. Sorry, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was saying.
Oh,
no, go ahead.
No, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about the kind of discussions we're having about it, working through it, is also this question. It's a little bit of kind of be a little bit of like a over-reduction of this question of how the Health Institute would work, but this question of like, what does it mean to have a piece of like public space that engages with public health, where like when you go there, you leave a little bit healthier, and it's not to say that we are necessarily aiming at like some sort of prototypical like new form of health infrastructure, but I think there's this kind of question, all these, I mean, just in this kind of like Foucault's question of the kind of like changes in the kind of medical profession and how they kind of developed over time, and the kind of staging that we have now in the kind of sequence of how you go to a clinic, then you might go to sort of a larger doctor's office, then finally to a hospital in these kind of stages. Like maybe there is either a sort of moment along that road that this kind of project could sort of like slot into, or there's like a divergent path. you know, this kind of like active piece of civic infrastructure that engages like public space and public health as a kind of like shared thing.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there is a very slow move towards that in medicine now. Like for instance, medical schools are often asking applicants to have studied the history of medicine before they apply, or medical humanities in general, because it allows the doctors to sort of see things more holistically rather than, I mean, typically the idea of a surgeon is that they like look at you like you're just a bunch of obstacles in the way of your liver or whatever they want to get at. So that's definitely, I don't know. It's definitely interesting. I'm wondering if it's almost like more of a medical role than a like physical space. You know what I mean? Like if it's like a nutritionist, you know, you'd have a kind of sort of person there who is like a kind of guru for how to like coordinate all these aspects of your health. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think that's kind of part of Cam. It might be helpful actually if you just present the whole pack in one. But I think that it's almost like a community center that is focused around health, be it nutritional, you know, like exercise, things like that.
I'll go ahead and share my screen as well.
Sounds like more of an agency for health.
Yeah, rather than a hospital.
Than a hospital.
And I think like what is interesting is that, sort of jumping back a few points, is that we're also trying to explore is how do you have someone be, because obviously there are requirements. There's times when you need to be isolated, not just during Corona times, but you know, how do you architecturally make someone feel less isolated and still isolate them? So like, you know, a really basic way would be to have lots of windows that look onto a park or something like that.
Right.
And also going off of that same thing, I think what a lot of people are learning throughout this whole situation that we're in right now, which maybe isn't super helpful for actually creating a space, but that it is possible to be together without existing in the same space. So considering the role of technology and the general interconnectedness of the world that we have now, can also lead, I mean, it can still, I think, produce specific architectures, but maybe not necessarily architectures for gathering. So
gathering by different means, like what we're doing right now. You're the sanatorium lady. What was your name again? Sorry.
No, I'm Fabi. That's Coco.
Oh, okay. Because the sanatorium is an interesting example because it was a hospital typology of sorts that was literally designed to isolate people from the city. So it was usually in the mountains or the countryside, and the idea was you would go there and like get sunlight and fresh air, and it would cure your tuberculosis. And it was kind of, I mean, it's kind of like the predecessor to the modern day, like, you know, tourist resort.
And I think, Coco, you were saying that some of them have later become tourist resorts.
Yeah.
Yeah, like they've been turned back into that.
I guess actually I would argue the sanatoriums and design of the sanatoriums affect how we live today, not just in tourist resorts, but balcony, fresh air, sunlight. I mean, it's in everything. It's in like housing.
Yeah, courtyards.
It kind of feels more like. Sorry, I was just gonna say real quick. It feels more like how do you feel than where does it hurt to me. That like it feels like architecture has a lot more agency over how do you feel than it does where does it hurt.
I had a,
Interesting.
sorry to jump right back in, but I had an exact question from that when I was leaving. Was read, and also whether or not, Daniel, you think there's a new version of the question after where does it hurt, now that we're dealing with something where there's so much asymptomatic cases, you may not know that it's hurting when it's hurting. Is there like a new update to what the next question is?
Without giving it much thought, maybe where have you been?
That's pretty good.
That was my gut reaction. Let me actually think about that. Yeah, it's like, where have you been and who have you seen, I guess. Yeah, because but that's more about the social aspect of the disease than about the disease itself. You know, it's not like the disease in your body, it's you transporting it around, which is super important.
It's spatial, which is very helpful for us.
Right. I just keep thinking about how interesting these Maggie centers are, simply because you can't like spread the cancer around. Although you can be immunosuppressed, but yeah.
Yeah, I think what's also the distinction being, I also think the Maggie centers are really interesting precedent to look at, or the multiple Maggie centers. And I think one thing that we're juggling that kind of differs insofar as like cancer is kind of always occurring. There are always new patients walking into Maggie centers for treatment or consultations. Whereas something like a pandemic or an epidemic has a very temporal quality to it, where maybe if you're thinking in terms of percentages, maybe it's only 1% of this building's lifetime, or you know, it's a 90-to-1 ratio of kind of daily life versus daily life in a pandemic. And so that's kind of another variable that we're juggling, because a lot of the conversation we're having, which I find really interesting, is actually might be only 1% of the daily life of this thing.
Right. I mean, it seems hugely important now because it's happening to us. But I mean, I think it's actually like slightly miraculous that I haven't lived through a pandemic before. And ironically, I've like spent, 10 years like studying like epidemics and like being, quite fascinated by them. And then when it actually happened to me, I was like, oh, this is kind of horrible. Like, this is like really oppressive and people are dying. Which, probably should have occurred to me. But people dying in 1832 does not have the same effect as people dying like down the street.
Did you feel prepared for this because of your studies?
I thought I would be more prepared, but no, actually. I've actually felt like a huge amount of pressure to like have something like super original to say about it. Like, to write some sort of article about like, some hot take on it. But there's not that much, I think, to say. Like, it's happening, and like my opinion on it is not going to change the virus's course of action. What I am doing instead is putting together a reader on some of the different aspects of the disease that have arisen. So both just basic contagion stuff, precedents from different diseases, and especially airborne diseases, but then also looking at the kind of like the race and class divide, which seems to have taken some people by surprise, which is shocking to me. It's like, were you not aware of this? And even the kind of like political opportunism that's arisen because of it. And then yeah, the kind of like skepticism, like vaguely anti-vaxxer kind of element of people who were denying that this was a real thing. Like the idea of like that, the whole hoax thing was very weird to me. Very exciting, like intellectually, but also just absolutely bizarre.
Apologies if you guys already covered this, but I was curious on the aesthetics question. And Maggie Center, I think, is a nice example of this, where each Maggie Center looks very different, but also looks really different, more or less, from certainly a hospital, what you picture as, let's say, a medical facility or a healthcare facility.
Right.
Especially now, very specifically, like, I think the aesthetic of this pandemic is very, at least for me, is very tied into like a particular blue that the face masks are. It's tied into a particular understanding of what the interior of an ICU looks like. And then on the other side, there's a whole like politics aesthetic from the talking head side. But do you find that, I don't really know what my question is, but I'm curious how important to health itself, to people's well-being and how they feel, how important is it that these healthcare facilities look a certain way and or look like a Maggie Center or something else completely? Does it?
Right. Well, I think that goes back to the question of like, where does it hurt versus how do you feel? I think the Maggie Centers are a good example of a renewed awareness of the fact that how you feel does actually matter. If you're only asking how do you feel and you're trying to treat a disease, then that's problematic. But bedside manner matters, as does this sort of psychological or post-traumatic stress situation of being ill. So for me, there's two things that are important. In the traditional model of the hospital, it's about the organization. And like organization theory in general is totally medicalized. It's based on the body, right? Like the word organization comes from your organs and like the sort of interaction of these individual elements that together form a body that functions as a whole, so like a system. And the hospital works in the same way, in that like you don't want your like blood mixing with your hold on, let me rephrase this metaphor. Like you don't want your organs like overlapping necessarily, because they're meant to do separate things and they're meant to isolate each other from each other. In the same way that you don't want like infectious diseases ward to be next to the maternity ward. So that's an organization problem, right? Or an organization solution. And it's an organization of space. And it's one that creates that power dynamic that Foucault talks about, which is using the doctor, using the patient's information, compiling it, and then using that as a method of treating the population as a whole, so of governmentality. The Maggie Centers are different in that they are more concerned with a bottom-up approach rather than in governing these people who are suffering from cancer, whether directly because they have cancer or because someone they know has cancer or because they're recovering from it. And I don't think they're incompatible, but at the same time, there does need to be some actual separation, some sort of boundary, because diseases do spread through various means. I think looking at the history of the sewer system is actually an interesting way, would be an interesting way of conceiving of what this health institute, health agency would need to do. Because there's a great book called, I have it right here. There's a great book called The Architecture of Closed Worlds, or What is the Power of Shit? It was published by Lars Muller and Storefront for Art and Architecture. But the idea is looking at the sewer systems as a sort of closed system that contains and isolates both wastewater that is potentially harmful and clean water that needs to remain clean until it's used. But there are, I mean, she traces the whole sort of history of architecture as a closed system. I mean, the architectures that are closed systems. And that doesn't mean that there aren't like gates in and out. But the sewer system, and people often forget that the sewer system is as much about drainage and waste disposal as it is about delivering clean water. But that to me seems like an interesting precedent. What's confusing to me, I mean, is just overwhelming to me is the idea of trying to do that with air.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
I mean, you know, the well-tempered environment is to some extent a sort of closed system of air circulation, but it's kind of more about temperature rather than than about sanitizing the air. I feel like someone was going to show me a stack or something.
Oh yeah, we were just that deck that we sent you last night. You're gonna walk through. Jesse suggested we walk through it.
Cam, do you want to share your screen and just kind of walk through very quickly that?
Sure.
So Daniel, we included a few of the studies. I think we've landed on a direction, but we're also continuing to explore.
So,
sorry.
Okay, yeah. This diagram is very clear to me.
So that's manifested kind of into our direction of the open stack. Going back to the kind of program diagram of having kind of 4 distinct enclosed spaces, each serving or catering to a larger kind of health need in the city. And I think it's important to note that maybe the daily life, as particularly me, I've been imagining it this way, is it's more about outside of kind of a pandemic or epidemic situation, if general health is made manifest by kind of maintenance, everyday health and general kind of knowledge, this can be an asset for the community, not only through a place to go kind of like work out or whatever, but also a place to go talk to a consultant. Dong mentioned this idea of kind of the genius bar of health. Insofar as like, oh, this feels weird, or I'm not so sure about my diet or whatever, you can go here and kind of talk to someone. So it's very much
like what are carbs anyways?
Yeah, exactly.
Like dumb questions you could ask. Yeah.
So that's kind of how we've been thinking about it. And so it's like I don't know how deep we went on the program diagram, but kind of the idea of a mental and physical health that kind of break down into more specific programming. So everything from medical, which might be kind of the more Genius Bar of Health or consultancies. I don't imagine we're, at this point, I don't think we've landed on doing kind of any sort of like invasive procedures. I think it's kind of more about gaining knowledge on a day-to-day, as well as kind of nutritional, athletic, and then educational and therapeutic and kind of cultural health, all under the kind of guise of what is social health in relation to the city, what is a healthy city, what is a healthy neighborhood, what is a healthy block.
What do you mean by cultural health?
So that's kind of what we're trying to make manifest. And I think it's a bit of a combination of accessibility to these things, but also a place for people to kind of come together under the pretenses of kind of a collective health. Maybe that's all that is a bunch of people who are interested in being physically healthy, egging each other on to be healthy. I don't know. But there's something nice about kind of like the groupthink mentality under health.
That sounds to me like insurance. Like an insurance company that I actually want to be a part of. One that, you know, is not some awful corporate invisible conglomeration, but one that is, I don't know, kind of more culturally active.
Yeah, and I wonder this kind of cultural dimension, what we sort of like touched on briefly about the people who are sort of most vulnerable to not only these kind of pandemics, but overall sort of systemic health issues, being sort of minorities, people of color, kind of the direct labor force. So there's this question, maybe like, you know, the cultural space that allows people to organize and have kind of a response to policy and kind of like the societal things that are sort of applied upon them and their health, like could also be this like dimension. So more than necessarily just, you know, and very much part of this like community advocacy dimension is also like a kind of like organizational like dimension to allow people to come together and have like a kind of collective
that occurred to me as well, because a major health issue is workplace injuries. And if there was say a lawyer available there for at least consultation, it would be, you know, addressing a type of health, a cultural health problem.
Daniel, also just to, Cam, if you can go back, wait, are we still sharing your screen? No.
Yep.
Oh, we are.
Sorry, you said there were 4 distinct spaces?
So we're thinking of kind of these 4 enclosed, the concept is kind of this open stack where we have, I don't know if you can see maybe I can annotate.
I can see the cursor.
Yeah, so kind of these 4 enclosed spaces. I realize they kind of look like slabs, but each one is inhabitable, and those kind of house more controlled program or indoor program.
Right.
Whereas the rest is kind of these platforms that exist in open air. But sorry, Dong, what did you want me to do?
I just wanted to clarify that point, that it just basically goes from interior in the slab to big open space, interior, big open space, interior, big open space. So the kind of places in between those slabs are just fully open air and outdoor, basically.
Okay. And those serve specific functional purposes that relate to specific health problems?
Yeah, one of the ways we thought to organize it was in this version, let's say there's the 4 slabs. So if we were to split it between, let's say, physical, mental, educational, and nutritional, for example, that there would be a series of enclosed spaces to serve those spaces that needed a roof, needed some kind of conditioning, needed walls, basically. So it could be anything from a 2-person consultation room or a doctor's office to a 100-person classroom or theater kind of thing.
Right.
And then the big open spaces, either above or below. I think right now we're landing at above. Directly above that slab is, in a way, thought of more like park space, but basically park space that's programmed relating to the floor below it. So I forget where we land on this, but one of the ones was if there's an educational floor that has a lot of classrooms, has, let's say, library and resources about health, has a lecture hall, the space above could be, I don't know, open air theater or open air places to kind of congregate around that idea of education and health. I think the open slabs are much less defined. Again, they're kind of just like us bringing pieces of the city, like stacking for 4 floors of park on itself in a way. But we were trying to tie it into the within the slab below it.
That seems reasonable. For some reason, what that made me think of was that I feel like that this combination of programs is going to widely expand the definitions of what is normal and what is pathological. Like you're going to end up having to address types of disease that perhaps aren't, or not disease, but types of health issues that perhaps aren't normally considered health issues. Things like loneliness. Like I was thinking about like that old people would really benefit from this. Old people who suffer from loneliness. My computer's dying. I don't know why the form made me think of that directly, but I think that's a testament to a successful design concept. What do you guys think?
Thank you. I mean, what's nice is I don't think we'd quite gotten to the sophistication of understanding a difference between normal versus pathological types of health issues. But
right.
In principle, what is great to hear is the idea that there, basically we didn't want to as clear a separation between what is considered health and what is considered just your life, I guess. I don't know how to put it. Like that was kind of that city and health diagram was kind of like, don't step out of your daily life to deal with the problem when it hurts or not. Any issues that are part of how you feel, or even specifically a point of pain, this is a place you can come to, even if you're just here for a walk, even if you're just here to read a book. So those issues like loneliness or things that are maybe not diagnosed as health problems, I think there's a home for it here. I really like that.
What are you envisioning being the management of the system? Is this like a subscriber service? Is this something your insurance would pay for, or have you not?
We are not that far along.
Right.
I'd love it if it wasn't any kind of exclusionary model.
Right.
That isn't to say that we could rely on the city to govern it, but it'd be great if it was as accessible as a public park.
Right. And I mean, a park is actually an instrument of health. Central Park was designed to improve the health of people living in tenements and squalor, and actually to prevent them from drinking all the time.
Really? Just by giving them open space to go hang out?
Sorry,
the drinking thing, just by giving them park space to go to, the thought was they would drink less?
Yeah, like part of the argument for like blocking off such a huge amount of valuable real estate was that they were worried that the urban poor would spend their time in saloons if they didn't have anywhere to go. So it was kind of like a what's the word? Temperance? Right? Like prohibition? Movement.
One thing you had mentioned, which I'm curious, and I don't want to rush you on an hour and a half now, but the idea of widening that definition of what constitutes health, I guess. Do you see that as, it seems like you were saying that as a positive, but we were also running into an issue. It's like, we don't want this to be overly, or we're a little worried that this would be overly general and really not addressing anything specific. In terms of models for institutions that deal with health, do you see a benefit with things being more specific versus being more of a catch-all, things being less defined versus more defined, and how effective they are with either treatment or, I guess, preventative care?
That's a tough one. I mean, it's like, for instance, the example of parks. I mean, Central Park, like it's very difficult to measure what the health benefits of Central Park are, but I'm sure they're enormous. Whereas, you know, there are also hyper-specific health initiatives like Jimmy Carter's foundation, which focused on one specific disease. And I think officially, as of this year, he managed to eradicate the disease, which was guinea worm. And it's the first disease since smallpox that's been eradicated. But that's because he focused on a disease that he thought was viable for elimination. So, I mean, there's obviously benefits to both. I think what's interesting about this project and what makes it like quintessentially urban is that it's going to have to mitigate those things in a way that a traditional hospital, or even a traditional clinic does not. Right?
Sorry, can you just expand on that last one a little bit? The way that they don't mitigate those things?
Well, with it would have to kind of take a wider definition of health in order to be effective as a kind of urban type of, or an urban typology, right? Whereas, like you were saying, the hospital is like something like that you go into and it's like you're in this like closed system and it like feels kind of otherworldly and whitewashed and whatever. You know, it feels very much like a laboratory that's designed to be outside of the city, or outside of the normal, sorry. Whereas this project seems like it wants to incorporate the everyday.
That's correct. It's interesting, I think that how do you feel and where does it hurt difference makes so much sense for hospitals, that they're so precise, that they're really geared towards very data-driven, information knowledge-driven treatments on very specific conditions.
But
sorry, just to interrupt, I think something that is crossing over a lot will definitely help with defining or refining program is we're talking in between two different, you know, say like comparing a park with a hospital. A park is somewhere you go and it's to a large extent self-sustaining in that you go and you take care of yourself by yourself. You don't need a healthcare worker to assist you in a park. Versus in a hospital, the hospital is half designed for the patient and half designed for the person that works there to care for the patient.
Well, it also actually has another half, a third half, if you will, which is that it's also designed for governmentality, which is that it's compiling data about health and about diseases and about like the people who have the diseases or whatever. Whereas I'm not sure that we need another one of those because we already have a functioning hospital system that measures, you know, measures whatever health statistics on the scale of the population. Parks don't do that, obviously, and I'm not sure that that this project would need to either.
I will say I like that, to Bella's point, and even in a way, I guess, to this point of generalized, more ambiguous health benefits like a park versus more clearly defined health like a hospital, is that dumbly our diagram of a building has two types. And I think that gives us even more definition on how to understand those two types of spaces. I think as dumb as it is, you can imagine in the slabs is where you are interacting with someone else, a caregiver. The park space is where you're just on your own, or general versus specific.
I mean, a really easy way to separate those would be to consider which spaces need to be clean, as in like, you know, sanitized, disinfected, and which can be like quote unquote dirty, in the way that a park is dirty. Not that it's like, you know, smeared with shit, but that it's like, you know, just not completely sanitized.
Well, like, I don't know. This is why I'm, you know, public toilets have always interested me so much, and why I think they're so important is because those are existing or should be existing public health institutes around the city. Like, it's a place you go to wash yourself in order to clean. Along the lines of, I don't remember the name of the author that you mentioned, Daniel, that said there are all these systems already in place, that, you know, the whole, you know, city is already to a certain extent has a network of health, because we're washing our hands, because we're cleaning ourselves, because we're flushing the toilets. Like, right. a public restroom still needs work, like still needs people working there, still needs people to maintain it, but the people that are using it can like use it themselves. They don't need help using it. I don't know. It's a
right, except for maintenance.
Yeah, the maintenance is what but it's not per user, I can think. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, they're not like wiping your ass.
Right.
I mean, in France, there's a weird institution of what's called the dame pipi, which is like the lady who, it's always a lady for some reason. I mean, for some reason, we know the reason. That sort of is in the public bathroom, like stalls. Sorry, not stalls, like a kiosk. And they basically clean the bathroom as it becomes dirty, rather than doing it like once a week or whatever. Mm-hmm. They also take money, like a euro or something. They're a dying institution.
So, Daniel, I don't know where this whole series of bringing people into pinups and talks is going to go, but
mm-hmm.
we've lightly touched on a lot of different topics, and I would love to invite you back again as we go along. Maybe, I don't know when, but
I would love to come back. I feel like I gave you like a shotgun kind of precision amount of information. So I hope some of it was useful.
It was perfect. I think that's kind of where we were looking for anyway, also because we didn't really know how to enter this kind of topic or conversation. I had no idea where it was going to go at all. So it was great. I don't know if anybody has any closing questions or statements before we sign off, but.
Would you like me to send you some texts about some of the things we talked about?
Absolutely. I think that'd be amazing.
Yeah. I'll try to avoid anything that's like too like philosophy of medicine-y, because I just don't think it'll help that much. But like one thing I think that you would find interesting is a text called The Normal and the Pathological, which was by Canguilhem, which is like Foucault's mentor, basically. And his argument is interesting because he's talking about how the idea of normalcy was only defined in contrast to pathology. So it was only because of disease that like normal was sort of classified. So that could, I mean, I could sort of see how that could translate into like a design strategy of sorts.
I feel like that also, and this is probably a chapter 2 version of this discussion, but as we were researching, and I know you have a lot of experience this, also that leading into specific kinds of modernism, I feel like was, I don't remember what example we were reading through, but something as defining itself away from pathological, I guess in this case, to set a sort of normal standard was based on a difference of aesthetic or the type of space it was creating. It did seem like it was like trying to set a normal based on responding to, I don't think it was called pathological in the piece I was reading, but like it was defining a problem, let's say, in order to set what the normalcy was.
Can I say something, even though I'm jumping in very late? It's in some ways summarizing, I think, something that Daniel pointed out and that I think Bella was touching on too, or I know thinks about, which I think is simply like the difference between institutions of health and provisions or infrastructures of health, and what their relationship is to the agency of the user or other agents, where most institutions of health have all these arrows going in and out, and also arrows that are kind of circumscribing them in not maintenance, but in work that happens within. And that provisions or infrastructures of health require something else, which has to do with maintenance. And the user has full agency throughout. So like Daniel said, there's nobody wiping somebody's bum when somebody passes through a park or even through a public toilet, both which I think can be understood as infrastructures or institutions of health. Equally, there's nobody wiping your bum if you're using the sewage system, right? And I think it's interesting to me to think about even the sewage system and its history in parallel to parks as separate from maybe, and Daniel, maybe you can prove me wrong here, but as separate from thinking of institutions of health that involve in and outs of data and in and outs of people, and that your agency, even contractually, I think that that's why it's important to start at a base of saying like, what are people's contractual involvement? Contractual in terms of like being a subscriber versus being institutionalized, because it has so much to do with one's agency. Once you enter a hospital, you know, if you're younger than 18, you can be forced to be sent to a hospital, right? If you're older than 18, it's up to you, but at a certain point you sign over your agency.
Right.
And I think that that's such an important difference in terms of defining health.
Right. It's like personal versus collective health, and the personal versus collective responsibility for health.
And accountability.
Right. I mean, a question that you should be asking yourselves, I think, every day anyways, is what is health for? And that's a whole nother discussion, but I think it would be interesting to consider, because health and hygienism, both the prophylaxis, the preventative medicine and treatment medicine, is very much tied to protecting wealth in various forms and labor. So I'll just leave that there so that we don't start talking about the entire history of
wellness.
Yeah.
This is Carrie. I was just gonna ask, like, and I think this is just reminding me, like, the difference between health and public health and what this project is kind of like geared towards. Is it personal health? Is it public health? Or is it somewhere in between? Is it trying to tackle all of that? And just kind of like how you're defining those different things. So.
I've been thinking about that a lot in regards to this pandemic, and just the definition of the word public.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and the just the question of personal responsibility to the public, how you have agency in that.
I mean, this last few months seems like the most visible and the most transformative version where both of those are almost one and the same. I don't know one and the same, but certainly like one affects the other in a way that I'd never imagined it would previous to this.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's in a way, I think what kind of led to the idea of starting the project was personal health or personal responsibility for your own health, and also your personal responsibility for other people's personal health having such a major impact on public health and publicness.
That in the sort of history and theory of medicine, there is always a very strong correlation between contagion and contract. Like the social contract, the like sort of Leviathan image as being the body politic is I mean, something that we have kind of forgotten because we're so used to being healthy. But yeah, that's like a very like foundational principle of health and public health, and even of the hospital system.
Daniel, till next time.
This was great. I can't believe this was an hour and a half. I feel like I just, yeah.
Thanks for taking so much time.
Yeah, of course. This is like what I love talking about. I could waffle for hours.
Well, you should come back, and it seems like you should meet Diana too, Dong's friend.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll try to get you guys together.
And I'm going to send, I guess, Bella, I'll send you some texts that I think are relevant, and you can circulate them as needed. And I want to hear from Sanatorium, maybe. Well, I forgot your name, sorry.
Coco.
That's me.
I'll put everybody who wants to be on the CC, I'll put them on the CC, and then who knows, they'll reach out to you directly, and then you can just ignore us all when you have other stuff to do.
Cool. I think I'm going to bother Coco.
Okay.
Like,
No, I have a lot of questions, but
Coco's in Hong Kong.
Some other two. Yeah.
So it's like 1 a.m. there.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, and yeah, like Bella, feel free to give anyone my email if you have a specific question, and I'll try to answer it.
Thanks, Daniel.
Right. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. See you later.
I had to hang up. Awkward.